Welcome to another episode of Preparing for the Unexpected. I'm your host, Alex Fullick, and as always, we like to talk about things related to disaster recovery, resilience, business continuity, well-being, emergency management, crisis management, anything that will help you, your organization, or your community prepare for, respond to, and overcome adverse situations. If you'd like to be a guest on the show, please feel free, reach out. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm the only Alex Fullick on LinkedIn, so I'm really easy to find, and I do respond to everything I get. One quick announcement, I will be speaking at the Continuity Insights Conference in Louisville, Kentucky, April 25th to 27th. Fingers crossed, it'll be an in-person event, and I'll get to meet some of you and maybe twist a few arms and get you to come on the show. I've said for quite a while that I would have been speaking, because it's now past tense, presented at the BCI World Conference, and I hoped to be able to get some of those other speakers to come on the show and talk about their subject or relatable topics. And today, my guest is one of those speakers from BCI World 2021. Speaking on the topic, and I'm really interested on this one, psychology and crisis management, I'd like to welcome to the show, Gavin Freeman. Gavin, welcome.
Thanks, Alex. Great to be here.
Now, I know who you are. I've read your bio and things like that. But literally, we have viewers and listeners around the globe. Can you take a minute or two and talk about yourself, what you do, and how you got into what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a psychologist by training. Started off my life took a very different path into psychology and went into sport and performance-based psychology. I'm very fortunate enough to be appointed to and part of several Australian Olympic teams working with athletes in the lead up to the games and then performing at the games. And during that time, I was challenged with coming up with the very first incident management protocol for the Australian Olympic team. This is back many, many years ago. And so I started to develop a process by which coaches would need to be, they would be the first point of contact if something were to go wrong, how we would then escalate that up through to the management and then the overall response. Now, this is back prior to 2000. So back then we didn't have the same level of sophistication, the same level of technology that we have available today. And so at the time then was pieces of paper, mobile phones was sort of all we had. We didn't have the luxury of the Zooms and the team meetings we had now. And so we really had to be structured in how we would go about responding to any incident. Interestingly, though, the work that I did in that incident management process was not too dissimilar to the work that we did with athletes in helping them prepare for the unexpected. Granted, it wasn't a crisis for them, but sometimes it was. They may have fallen in their first run and they only had their second run to perform. So for them, different form of a crisis process, but obviously that same kind of mindset that goes into managing through an event that was, whether it was unintended or unpredicted or something that just really happened out of the blue. So that's where it all started. I've written a few books along the way, and then my business now focuses primarily on crisis management, but at the CEO and the C-suite level, is how CEOs and their executive teams are responding. But then also looking how we unpack that into the development of their strategy and how they roll their strategy out through the business so that it can encompass any of these types of events to ensure that they can maintain not just the continuity of the business, because that's one angle, but also the trust within their organization and in their wider community and their market. And for me, trust is probably the most powerful emotion that we have when it comes to any form of crisis management, because any decision you make has to engender or foster trust in the people that you're making the decision with or the people that you're making the decision for. And so that's kind of where I am now. Based here in Melbourne, Australia, tend to work with companies all over the world, providing insight, guidance, training, simulations, and development of all things around crisis and strategy management.
Melbourne is the one city in Australia I still need to get to. Brisbane, Sydney, and Gold Coast, and a few other places 2 or 3 times, but I still haven't made it over to Melbourne yet.
Unfortunately, in 2021, we're also known as the most lockdown city in the world.
Yeah, I heard.
It's been an interesting insight around the psychology of locking down a city for a long period of time. The way our clients have responded in Melbourne, as opposed to the way our clients have, say, responded in in Perth or Singapore or London or New York, we've seen quite significant differences and reactions of the people, but also the business and the way the market or the community has responded to said business has been quite different. So it's almost been like its own little control group looking at Melbourne businesses compared to, our New York clients and our London or Singapore clients.
Right. Well, welcome to the show. I'm happy to have you here. And considering the topics of well-being and mental health happening right now, I think psychology and crisis management is a really interesting topic that's going to help link some of these things together, I think, at some point. Absolutely. So let's jump in with your presentation from BCI. You started off talking about an incident actually in Australia. I'm not going to give anything away. I'll let you take it away and explain the whole thing.
It was really a tragic incident that happened, and without minimizing the impact of the tragedy, which was absolutely awful, and my heartfelt thoughts go out to the family even now, several years down the track. We've just actually finished a coronial inquest into the event, and further lessons have been learned and sort of decisions made by the courts here in Australia. But for those people who may have followed in the news, we have a theme park in Australia called Dreamworld, and Dreamworld's like one of those. It's like Disneyland. It's like it's similar to those. It's got all these great rides on it, family rides as well as the thrill rides. And what was particularly tragic about the event that happened in Dreamworld back in 2016 was that there was a tragic event that occurred around what is effectively or was a family ride. It's a ride I've been on with my kids. It's a ride you would take your kids and elderly parents on. It's one of those kind of just chill rides. You're sitting on a sort of a circular boat and you go around in a circle. Unfortunately, when the boat returned back to the main section, it malfunctioned and it flipped over, and unfortunately and tragically 4 people perished in that event. And so we looked at that event, and then we started to see how it unfolded. And it, as I said, it's less about the event, and it's what I was starting to focus on was the response of the organization, looking at how the parent organization responded, looking at how they communicated with the media and the family at the time. And we got to see some really interesting lessons learned. And look, unfortunately, and I think history will support the statement, that they didn't probably handle it particularly well. There were a number of factors that occurred at the time. So at the exact same time of the event, the parent company was going through their annual general meeting of all their shareholders, and the chair effectively said, well, that was an event, but now we're going to still go and pay all of our CEOs and our directors huge amounts of bonuses. So there was kind of this disconnect in the language that was coming out by the chair and the CEO of the parent company, as opposed to what we were seeing from Dreamworld and its CEO and the like. And there was also some really different language that was coming out. So the language that was coming out was clearly being articulated by their legal team, and it was all fixated on the protection of the business. And the commentary around the people involved was almost a secondary thought. So it was, we're communicating with the relevant support services, we're working with police. And our heartfelt thoughts go out to the family. Clearly the wrong way around. Should have been family first, and then do that. There was a particularly nasty incident, not nasty, an unfortunate incident where the CEO of the parent company maintained that she had got in contact with the family. This was live on TV during this annual general meeting, and the reporter actually had a family member on the phone saying, I have a family member here and you haven't. So she was caught in a little bit of a lie in real time. And look, in her defense, not to defend her, but in her defense, she maintains that she had attempted to call, but her language is the point I want to put out here. While she may have attempted to, the language she used was, I have. And so that point I was making before around trust is that when we lose trust, which is what happened in this scenario, we see a significant reduction in connection with the company, with connection with the people, and belief in what they're saying. And in Australia, and particularly for Ardent, which was the parent company, we saw that then reflected in their share price. So within a matter of days of the incident and these follow-up communications that weren't particularly on task, their share price dropped nearly 23%. Within the next 3 months, further communications were made, further insights were developed, further information was handed in that sort of highlighted some of their poor maintenance practices and other forms of lack of leadership. And we then saw their share price drop a further 30%. So over a period of about 3 months, their share price plummeted 50%. And the point that I want to make out of this, and I know I'm now focusing on the money side of things, is that that's where we see the impact, return on investment, shareholder value. Their shares have never recovered. So, from a high of up in the late high $2 a share, $2.30, $2.40, I think they're currently trading somewhere, I don't know, I'd need to double check, but I think they're currently trading at around $1. Now, they dropped down to 97 cents. So it's that connection. Whereas on the flip side, we did see other events happening where we saw, the commentary of the CEO or the commentary coming out of the organization acknowledged what was going on, took them down a different pathway, and their share price, while dipped as well, picked up significantly. So we see, and sorry, back to Ardent. The other thing that the ultimate in and amongst the share price plummeting, income and income just obviously bottoming out. CEO lost her position. The CEO of Dreamworld ultimately resigned as well. So there was significant loss of key personnel who had significant years of experience in running sort of businesses. So we're seeing major impacts occurring across the business. And as I said, unfortunately, they've never really recovered.
You made a whole bunch of interesting points there. A couple I just want to touch on. I was always told in crisis management or communications, never let the lawyers get involved when you're talking with any impacted party or the media. Never let the lawyers get involved. And any lawyers listening out there, feel free, send me a letter. I don't care. But because this has been told to me the entire time I've been in, business continuity management, etc.
Yeah, we use a particular analogy in our business in the way we help crisis teams manage, and we use a great little analogy. It's called prize. Keep your eye on the prize, and we like prize for a number of reasons. The very first letter of the acronym P stands for people. So when you're keeping your eye on the prize, your people are your number one point. R stands for reputation, I is for IT and infrastructure, S for sites, and E for external third parties. And almost when we're looking at crisis communications, we're almost using that same protocol. You always go out with your message about your people to your people first. Your reputation then becomes secondary. And quite frankly, in communications, you don't communicate a whole lot about infrastructure, sites, and external third parties. But if you wanted to, it's really the bottom. If your building's going to be closed, it's maybe down the bottom of your statement. It's not, we're shut in the building, we're communicating with emergency services, oh, and by the way, we're really upset a few people were taken to hospital and are being cared for. It's being very clever, not clever, it's being very conscious of the impact and who's listening to your message, and people has to come first. There's no ifs, buts. So I agree. And I have many legal friends out there. In fact, we're jumping a little bit all over the place, but it's one thing I would guide organizations to do is it's not to keep the lawyers out, but it's to use your legal brains to help understand and craft the potential impact of the message. So it's not getting rid of the lawyers, but the lawyers do need to be there, but they need to understand what they're trying to achieve through messaging. And unfortunately, lawyers tend to operate usually from always look to protect the business. When a crisis occurs and there's people involved, you're actually looking to protect the people. The business will deal with it afterwards. There are lots of risk mitigation strategies businesses have, notwithstanding insurance policies and the like, to deal with that impact after the fact. But look after your people first.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I remember reading a long time ago something to the effect of, I can't remember the exact words, but it said, if people aren't impacted, is it still a disaster? Regardless of what happens, is it still a disaster if people aren't impacted?
Well, I think, yeah, it's an interesting question, because I think in this current day and age, if you look at what's happening, say with Bitcoin, with its its highs and its lows, and when we have a major loss in value and people are losing money, the argument would be, well, is the loss of money going to impact people? And so, to your point, yes, it will be. But if there's no direct harm to people, then the question becomes a little bit more theoretical in nature, because how do we cause harm? If harm's caused by you've lost your savings, then yes, there's harm caused there. So if it's maybe not physically harm, but if you can't pay for your utilities or your house, then that's going to cause harm. So look, I agree with you fundamentally, but we do see multiples of business crises that occur that indirectly will always impact people.
Yeah, agreed. One of the other things I thought was rather interesting you talked about is the, sorry, did you say it was the annual shareholders meeting they were having at the time? So with considering the terrible nature of what happened and people dying and all those people that are impacted that were involved, it also gives the wrong optics, as though you're rewarding bad behavior because they were dishing out all these bonuses and things too. So it's like, wait a minute, you just had deaths and now you're rewarding yourself for this?
Yeah, their argument at the time, and I do vividly recall these conversations being had, their argument at the time was that they are legislated to have this annual general meeting, right? Under Australian law, under the various regulatory requirements, you're meant to have some of these meetings. I would argue in this current environment, in the environment they were facing at the time, had they fallen foul of it's called ASIC, which is our regulator that looks after companies. Had they fallen foul of an ASIC rule or the ASX, well, ASX is just the share price, the ASIC ruling, I'm quietly confident that ASIC would have been tolerable of them pushing their annual general meeting by a couple of days, a couple of weeks. Yes, they may have fallen foul of the law per se, but what we do also recognize is that when these events happen to the level that they happen at, we also need to take into account the potential impact of not having the annual general meeting versus having it and doing what they did, as opposed to not having it and feeling the wrath of the fine incurred by not having an annual general meeting in time. If I was guiding them now, I would say to them, whatever fine you get from ASIC will pale in comparison to the fine that the public will give you based on your actions now. So that would have been my guidance. I wasn't there, but that would have been my guidance at the time. Yeah,
and 4 deaths is an extenuating circumstance. That's out of the ordinary. That's something that hey, we're putting things on hold, because you're right. If I was dealing with that organization, or I wanted to go there, because before we started recording, I said I knew where this was and I've actually driven past it and I wanted to go there. But now the next time I'm in Australia, I think it'll be the 3rd or 4th time, if I'm driving down that highway and I see it again, what am I going to think?
And it's taken a long time. It really has taken a long time. I mean, they made some other really interesting decisions. So I'm giving these because when we get into the point around, the way the brain operates and the decisions we make, they made some other really interesting decisions. So the accident occurred on the 25th of October. I don't know why, and I don't understand it, but they decided they were going to reopen on the 28th, 3 days after a death, which was never going to happen. I mean, and look, their perspective was, we want to open it up and we want to recognize what had happened. Yeah. But what did the public say? Well, the public said, you're just opening up to make money. You're just opening up to maintain your revenue. And so the negative feedback they got from the public sentiment was absolutely, it was a tsunami of negative feedback. And so they didn't actually open until the 10th of December, 2016. So, so then it never happened. So it took a month and a half before they reopened. that ride was dismantled and has never come back again. There were significant, safety reviews done at the time. So they did all the right things after the fact.
Yeah.
It was, the bit that I'm focusing on is the leadership at the moment in time, and the decisions that were made at the moment in time have had far-reaching ramifications than I think they even would have expected.
And on that note, we've come to the end of our first segment. We're talking with Gavin Freeman today on the topic of psychology and crisis management. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Today we are talking about psychology and crisis management with Gavin Freeman. Gavin, lots of great insight there in the first segment. And like I said, I know where Dreamworld is, and I know I'm going to have a different thought the next time I see the place. But in your presentation, you were talking about different theories, and one of the theories you talked about was upper echelon theory. What is that?
Yeah, so it's an interesting insight around when we first start to look at the way the brain makes decisions under any form of stress or perception or pressure, or a situation where there's some external adverse event or a stimuli that we're needing to respond to. Traditionally, we thought we just used basic cognitive rational thinking, right? That's what we train you to do. As a leader, we train you to think logically, cognitively, rationally, gather the data, and then make a decision based on that data. What the upper echelon theory enhances that perspective is to say that we need to consider what are the other characteristics, and these are the more emotional based characteristics, and not just emotional based ones, but also kind of the broader characteristics of the individual, and how those characteristics can then influence the way we make cognitive decisions. Because there'll be times where you'll sit down and you think, why did that person do that? Mm-hmm. Right? It doesn't make sense. That's the language we use. We look and we go, that doesn't make sense. Why did they do that? Yeah. And so some of these, so when we look at cognitive, the neocortex, the part of our brain that makes cognitive decisions, we know how it works. Look for data, interpret data, right? Now the problem becomes is, how do we interpret that data? And this is where the upper echelon characteristics come into play. And they include things like how old we are. The older we are, we have different decisions. We have different life experiences. We think about our career experiences and what we've had, our levels of education, our socioeconomic roots, our financial position, and the broader characteristics of the group that we're in. And so we start to take these upper echelon characteristics and we then merge them with our cognitive brain. And we go, okay, now we start to get a better picture around why do certain people make decisions in certain circumstances. Where I find this interesting is when there's two types of CEOs. There's the CEO that gets promoted within a business. So they've started off in the mail room and kind of worked their way up and landed as the CEO. That's one kind of pathway, or at least has worked within their industry all the way through. There's another type of CEO who knows nothing about the business. They're that perennial journey person CEO. They go from one CEO to another, and they just bring their CEO characteristics. They potentially know nothing about the business. And I've worked with both, and both are very successful for different reasons. But we start to see these characteristics started to come through in regards to why are people making decisions at different times. When we then merge the two together, it allows the individual to then look into their armory of strategic choices and make a decision that's based on not just a cognitive interpretation, but one that's sort of colored by other factors. The problem with these other factors is they're really hard to measure. They're really hard to see, because age is just I don't know how old you are, and I'm not going to ask, but it doesn't matter. But, it reflects, well, what is it about age that colors out or changes our thinking? What is it about our experience or our previous careers or our socioeconomic status or our education? And that's the problem. We don't know. We know they impact, but we just don't know how they impact. So it comes into then trying to understand the bigger picture around, well, what are some of the other factors that can drive some of these decision makings? And that's where the two other theories that I talked about in my presentation come into play. So within those, we've got a little bit more of an idea. So one's called the regulatory theory and the other one's called behavioral agency. Mm-hmm. And we know from a regulatory theory perspective that the way we regulate our brain against either pleasure or pain. So we know that There are some people who will like to seek pleasure-seeking activities, and there are others that are far more driven by the avoidance of pain. Doesn't mean they don't seek pleasure. It just means they're more driven by, I don't want to make a mistake. I don't want to fail, as opposed to, I'm going to have a go at potentially winning the big prize.
Is that
right?
the same as risk averse, being a risk averse?
A little bit around the risk seeking versus risk averse, right? So we know that there are individuals who are far more risk seeking type individuals, and there are ones that are far more risk averse. Now, on the surface, that would come across as being pretty simplistic. Alex, you might be risk seeking and I might be risk averse. But then we need to start to look at, well, what impacts on that? What drives that? So let's say, your show's doing really, really well, right? You're getting, your numbers are getting bigger and bigger every week. More people are watching, right? And you're a risk averse person. You're now going to getting a little bit of conflict, because lots more people means maybe you can try something different, have a go down a different pathway, maybe introduce a new topic. But if you're really risk averse, you're not necessarily going to, or you're going to be torn. You're going to be really, challenged in that environment because of your positiveness. Now, if your show was tanking, well, your risk averse behavior is probably going to benefit you, because you're going to go, right, I'll go back to my current behavior. But I could also argue you're not going to try something new to get new listeners or followers. Right. So context starts to matter, and it starts to give us insight around what is driving these behaviors. But at the core, you are going to be either driven to be risk averse or driven to be risk seeking. I often like to I wrote a book called Just Stop Motivating Me. And rather than the risk element, I use the motivational element. And so you could also flip it to say, you're motivated to avoid failure as opposed to motivated to succeed. And the fundamental difference between those two mindsets are, one is you're looking to, you see failure as a stepping stone to future success, as opposed to not wanting to be negatively evaluated by yourselves or others. And so there's these two fundamental differences. And that's where we start to see regulatory theory starting to play out, where if you're motivated to succeed, you're going to approach your crisis in a different way to being if you're motivated to avoid failure. And then to really throw the cat among the pigeons, as that famous saying goes, there's this really interesting behavioral agency theory that now comes in and says, actually, none of that matters. The thing that matters is the agency, as in the organization, as in the culture, as in the board. So if the board sets the tone of, we're a risk-averse company, well, then the CEO and the executives are going to follow suit. So behavioral agency says, look, the board, and here's where it kind of gets a little bit confusing. So I don't want to kind of burden people with all the theory. Suffice to say, there's lots of ways to just look at the situation. But the theory would also maintain that a risk-averse board is going to appoint a risk-averse CEO. That is just going to follow. Why would a risk-averse board put on a Richard Branson or an Elon Musk style person if that person's just going to go off and do a million things, and try and aim for the Mars rather than just trying to, get somewhere on the planet. So between the two theories, though, it helps us when we go into teams and helps us build and develop the nature of the way we want to support the team. So if I know you're driven by your regulatory theory, or if I know you're driven by your agency, I can then support you in different ways.
So how does that come across in a crisis situation then?
Often the only way
to determine, how we talk with the media, how we communicate with employees, or how do we not talk with impacted families, like the example you gave.
The way we can really only so there's two ways to measure it. One's a little harder than the other. The two ways to measure it are around looking at the speed and the execution of the decisions that are made, which is very difficult to measure. So how do you measure a decision? I decided to do A versus B, but you can't see the decision-making process. You can just see the outcome. I went with a black shirt, you went with a white shirt, right? Something in the backs of our heads kind of worked that through. The one though the one we can measure, or at least observe, is language. So we see risk-averse or motivated to avoid failure individuals use what we call preventative language, whereas the more motivated to succeed or risk-seeking people tend to use more performance-based language. And so this gets then seen through, and there's lots of research out on this, and they've done lots of research on US presidents' speeches and State of the Nation speeches. They've looked at individuals during crisis, looking at their commentary coming through, and we can clearly see this. So we see this kind of preventative language, words like prevent, protect, safety, security, threat, vigilance, obligation, accuracy, avoid, anxiousness, those kind of words, as opposed to your more performance-based words around momentum, obtain, optimistic, progress, promoting, speed, advancement, desire, earn. Those are just a few simple ones that sort of come off the top of my head. So we definitely see the language that comes out from organizations and from executives when they're in front of the media and they're promoting themselves. We see different language, and that's usually a good indicator of where the organization is coming from and where the pathway they're likely to follow going forward.
But if they're talking, using either one of the language, the performance or the preventative language, is that on behalf of the organization, or is it the person who's behaving that way?
And this is where regulatory versus behavioral agency theory will start to help out. So, when I go and work with an organization, the first thing that I will do is spend time with their CEO to understand the way that they operate, understand how they naturally speak. And then when you see them in a crisis, you'll then start to see where there's a disconnect. Mm-hmm. You'll also try to get a sense of meeting with the board and understand, the language the board uses. And I would always go and look at previous scenarios around situations, what commentaries come out from the board. We have some companies that have got very high profile board members and some that have got far lower profile board members. I would look at the way they would naturally speak. So you can get a sense of the person's natural state. And then when it comes out, it's very clear. And you can absolutely look, if you know what you're looking for, you can absolutely see the discomfort in a risk-averse CEO being forced to speak in a risk-seeking way, because that's the directive the board wants to go. You can see it. There is this thing called congruency. The brain always strives for congruency. So it's that simple one. If I said to you, Alex, put your head down, and I want you to, pretend you're being punched in the gut, and I want you to pretend, and I want you to think to yourself, I am an absolute winner. I am the best interviewer on the planet, but I want you to sit there kind of looking miserable. Your body's going to go, this is wrong. This feels wrong, right? And we can do the other way around. If I said to you, shoulders back, nice and proud, and think to yourself, I'm a complete loser. Again, over time, that congruency is what the brain will always go for. We tend to want to reflect what we're thinking. And so when we see that disconnect happening, we see the discomfort coming through in people. I see the discomfort in the back room when I'm working with CEOs during a crisis and they're having to make decisions. They take longer to make decisions when there's a disconnect. They're not confident in their decision-making when there's a disconnect. They're not confident in their team when they're not having kind of commentary coming through to them. So there are so many factors that you wouldn't see playing out, but we see in the back end, and we can actually work with groups to help them enhance and improve on that.
You just mentioned an interesting point where they're waiting for information from teams. Does their behavior and based on the theories you just mentioned, also affect the people that are around them on what using yourself and myself as an example? If you're one way and I've got information to give you, and you behave a certain way, you communicate a certain way, but I need to give you some really hard information that's happened. Does that have an impact on me, how I'm presenting to that person as well? Like, does it trickle on down? You know what I mean?
The tone is often set by the lead in the top, whether the lead's the CEO or at least senior executive. Look, absolutely. I've run multiple simulations where I've seen leads completely and CEOs completely diminish the impact of their team by simply saying, it's my way and I'm deciding, regardless of the input coming in. Highly effective teams effectively remove rank, right? I have a particular theory that I apply to this. It's I don't know where I got it from, but it's my definition of value. The The only reason I want you in the room with me, if I'm a CEO and I'm managing a crisis, the only reason I want you in the room with me is if you can provide value. And the value is made up of two core variables, insight and tension. If you're not giving me a version of those two things, you're not helping me.
Well, I've seen many definitions of value. I have never seen one that has the word tension. What
Absolutely.
does tension mean in that?
So in that space, the insight is you're the expert on doing what you're doing, right? So give me your expertise. But then the tension might be, we're doing this interview now. The tension element might be at the end, giving me some feedback on the way I communicated, the speed in which I spoke, the tone, what I was wearing, glasses, hair, those extra echelon variables that don't necessarily on first thing. So, you could walk out of today and just go, thanks a lot, that's great. Or you could walk out of today and go, thanks a lot, that's great. Here's a little bit of feedback, here's some tips, here's some things that I can think of. So that's in a simple example. For me, tension is around recognizing when we need to sometimes stress test an idea. So I've seen executives who completely agree with the CEO and they take on that classic Edward de Bono black hat mindset and go, can we just play devil's advocate for a second here? I just want to challenge your thinking. I want to make sure that you've considered all of the elements. So tension could be a simple quality check, or it could be, I think there's another option here. And as far as going, actually, I think you're wrong. So in a crisis environment, if you're not adding some insight and some tension, you're not adding value.
That's interesting. I saw that at your presentation and went, I have never seen that before. What the heck does he mean by that?
I should trademark it then, huh?
Yeah, you should. I've never seen it before. On that note, we've come to the end of our second segment. We are talking about psychology and crisis management with Gavin Freeman, and we will be right back. Welcome back. Today we are talking about psychology and crisis management with Gavin Freeman. Gavin, great second segment there, especially when you were talking about value and tension. How can we use that tension going forward in a crisis, or maybe even outside of a crisis, but how can we use that going forward?
So the first thing we need to do is recognize that it exists. When I use the word tension, a lot of people sort of go, oh, that's a bad word. It's a negative word. It's a negative connotation. But in fact, it's not. And I think the more we can bring it in, that those conversations that we can have to ensure that we're adding value, the more effective we're going to be. I think the starting point for most groups and most organizations is you do need to get to understand your CEO and your executives that are involved in a crisis. My experience tells me, you're lucky if you maybe get them once a year for some sort of a tabletop desktop exercise. Those are a complete waste of time. I'm sorry for those of you who run them. A desktop exercise with a CEO is an absolute waste of time if you really want to understand the way they make decisions under pressure and the way they respond. They're great for just ticking boxes to say, yes, we've got a plan and we've done the plan and the auditors want that. I happily accept that. So we need to understand our CEOs. We've got to be able to just, and the rest of the exec team that's involved, we've got to get on their radar more often. We've got to speak to them. We've got to ask them questions. We've got to pose situations to them and see what they think. So the first thing is the once a year or once every second year type tabletop exercise has got to be supplemented with some more stuff. That's an absolute. Now, the challenge in that is saying, how do we now get it on the agenda of the CEO? The good thing we've seen out of COVID is that crisis management, pandemic management, all forms of risk management have significantly been increased in the eyes of the board and of the executive. Yeah. So we know that it's time to capitalize on that. It really is. We need to get out there. We need to demonstrate, and I'm speaking out to those, crisis managers, the BCM managers, all those individuals who are sort of hold the accountability of this project in the business. We've got to capitalize. Right now, cyber attacks and ransomware is what I'm doing every day of the week, and the boards are concerned about it. CEOs are concerned about it. So that gets me in front of them on a regular basis. So have a hook, have some reason to be able to speak to your board. Right now, 2021, it's ransomware. 2 years ago, it was the active aggressor threats. Who knows where it's going to be in a couple of years' time. Second thing we can do is we can actually start to look at the language. So I can go and review, commentary. I'll often go and watch CEOs speaking. I'll look at them in speaking in positive sides of things. So my favorite, what I always do is I'll go and watch how a CEO presents at their annual general meeting when times are going really well. Hey, we've had a bumper year. We've made all this millions of dollars. You listen to their language. You then go and look at a time where they may be fronting the media around something that didn't go really well. Look at their language there. If there's a disconnect between the language, it's a little flag that needs to go off for you to say, I've got to understand why. What's the language? There should be consistency, even though the words will be different, but there should be consistency in tone. Probably the biggest thing that I've found that's been useful for CEOs is to run them through not just scenarios, but real life scenarios where we do a real life activation. So we launch something into a business and we actually watch it percolate through the business. We see it happening in real time. We don't allow, I right of now, unless there's a very good reason for it, I very rarely run a tabletop exercise. Mine are always going to be a scenario-based exercise where I'm going to put you under the pressure, I'm going to put you under the pump, I'm going to make you feel what's going on because I want to see how you respond. The other way to do that is to do a review session. And so what we do with review sessions is we run them like scenarios, except the difference here is a scenario is a made-up scenario. A review session is when we take an actual real-life event that's happened to another company, and we put that in front of the executive and say, this happened to this person or this organization. It's the same industry as you, same business as you. What would you do if it was yours? So they then get to see the decisions made from others. So there's a few other little bits and pieces, but that kind of start is understand them, build them, and then have these scenarios and review sessions are incredibly powerful. And my feedback to those of you who sort of never done a review session or you can't get them to do the scenario is push for it, because my feedback to me has always been when the CEOs feel like they've got value out of it, they want to do more. Particularly the review sessions where they look and because it's a little bit protected. It's Alex stuffed up, not Gavin. So now let me look at what Alex did and why Alex stuffed up, not what I'm doing and why I stuffed up, because if I learn from Alex. So I think that's kind of our starting point. There's a few other little bits and pieces that I think we can do as in this space. We can share insights from other organizations. So the conferences and the like, those are always really helpful. And the last thing I would say to you is don't be scared to get external specialists in. So in my team, we have, we call them special operations groups. So in America, they call them the SWAT team. I don't know what they call them in the UK, but it's generally those very scary men and women in black with black helmets on. They come in. Yep. We get media specialists in, we get cyber coaches in, we bring medical doctors in. So we will often bring in the specialists to give them the guidance and provide them with the absolute, this is what it happens. When the pandemic launched, when the pandemic hit, one of our members of our team is an emergency doctor. He's never been so busy in our business. There were times where he was going, I've got to get back to the hospital now, guys, I'm sorry. So he was dealing with case crisis in the hospital, but he was coming in and talking to our clients around what this disease looks like, what you'll experience, not what you saw in the newspaper, not what you've seen in the media. Here's an ED doctor telling you what's going to happen. So I think those kind of snippets can hopefully be helpful for companies and for individuals who are trying to get their CEOs and the executive teams up to scratch.
What about CEOs or executive teams that really don't want to face those fears? They would rather, and I've run into them, I'm sure you have too, we'll deal with it when it happens. Yeah.
So look, they're hard. And for me, on occasion, we've been asked to come in and do what we call the what keeps you up at night session, or the worst case scenario session. The good thing is most CEOs, or at least most public companies, will have to do a risk mitigation process. So they'll look at the risks in their business, but they tend to look at the risks in their business around actual risks around financial risk, or they don't tend to look at risks around when things go completely pear-shaped. That generally doesn't make it onto a risk register. So we need to do these other kind of worst case scenarios. if you really have a belligerent group that doesn't want to engage, this is where a review of here's what happened somewhere else can be quite confronting. I know one client who just would never be able to get the CEO involved. And the way we got them there was we took articles and things that had happened to another organization in the same industry. We put the CEO's name into the article. We sent it to him and we said, how would you feel if this was real? And they got a phone call in an hour saying, what the hell is this? And how do we fix this? Because this is never happening to me. And we went, great, we'll fix it. Give us an hour in about a month's time. And they did. And it's progressed from there. So I think there's ways. Sometimes, sometimes the softly approach is not going to work. Sometimes we do need to put something right in front of their faces and say, have a look at this. This is not good if this were to happen to you.
Scare or shock.
Yeah, I think there's a time for that shock value. Not always, but I think there's a moment. If you really have a group that is stuck, the only way to unstick them is to shock them.
We only have 2 minutes left. Do you have any final thoughts? Take a minute for any final thoughts you want to convey.
Yeah, don't set and forget. Continually iterate on your plans. Continually iterate on the way you do things. Make sure you include all of your alternates. Most organizations only ever train their primary team, so get the alternates in. Make sure everybody in the business, not just the crisis team, actually understands you have a crisis process. It's amazing how many businesses I go to where you'll talk to a front-end service person and who says, I have no idea. A quick example, and then I'll finish it up. We ran a scenario where the police were turning up with a warrant. And so the crisis team knew exactly what to do with the warrant. They were arresting a person. They knew exactly how to manage that. You know what they forgot to do? Check the protocol of what happens when a police officer turns up at the reception and says to the receptionist, here's a warrant. You now need to let me in the building. The receptionist had no idea what to do. There was a process and a policy. They had never seen it. It had never been discussed, never trained. So extend your crisis management out to your entire business.
Interesting. Yeah, anything can happen at any time. You can't assume everybody's available all the time.
That's right. Absolutely.
On that note, we've come to the end of the show. Gavin, thank you so much for this. I thought the topic was really interesting. Like I said during one of our breaks, I've really been interested in this psychology of disasters brought on, mostly by COVID. So I really found this interesting, and I love the piece about tension.
Thank you.
So, and I'm going to go look at your book too, because I like that one. Was it Motivate?
Just stop motivating me.
Just stop motivating me. Yeah. I'd like to, I think I'm going to track that down. I might have you back again to talk about that.
More than happy to have a chat about it.
So thank you so much. Have a great day, and everybody listening and watching, stay prepared, everybody. If you liked that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave a message and let me know what your thoughts are. If you'd like to be a guest on the show to talk about something related to business continuity, disaster management, COVID, personal well-being, anything that's relatable to those subjects, you can reach me through my LinkedIn profile, which is in the video description. And of course, don't forget to subscribe. In the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.